Hi everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, I think Rob and I are getting a little ambitious because this week on the podcast, we try and fix the whole of property.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. There's so much in our discussion this week. We're talking about planning, we're talking about rent controls, we're talking about economic cycles. There's a lot going on. So if your mind is spinning by the end of this episode, don't worry, stick around for Hub Extra because we've got a great tool to help you unwind.
So a couple of weeks ago, we did the podcast, How to Invest Over the Next 7 Years. And we were pretty positive about the property market. And we felt, based on the property cycle, that from this point on, things will improve and optimism will increase. Well, very conveniently, Rob, we've got two news stories that seem to back up that theory.
Yes, there are lots of different indicators all converging on the same thing, which is always encouraging. So there's not just one number that there might be a problem with that's leading you to a false conclusion. You're seeing it in lots of different places. So there's a story about property development confidence. And so there's a 17% increase in new buyer inquiries for land, which shows that developers are keen on building again. And because a development can take a couple of years, that shows that they seem to think that the next couple of years are going to pan out okay. And there's more certainty around what market conditions will be in a couple of years' time than there was previously. There's also another story with data from an online valuation service saying that the number of potential sellers requesting valuations from estate agents more than doubled between December and January. Now, you'd expect it to be up anyway because December's always a quiet month and January is when people decide they're going to make a change and take action anyway. But doubling is quite a significant increase. And you were telling me earlier, Rob, that you've seen the effect of this locally to you as well.
Yeah, nothing scientific, but I just keep an eye on the local property market. I've got alerts on for when new properties come on, just because I'm nosy, really. And yes, of course, there's a January increase, but for the last 6 months, it's been really, really quiet, the local property market to me. And in the last 6 weeks, it's gone crazy compared to the previous 6 months. Loads of new properties coming onto the market. Far from like boom times, but just really noticeable, like a significant increase. So I think the signs are there. Estate agents seem to be more positive. Developers seem to be more positive. And just our personal observations, things seem to be improving as well. So does this mean it's a boom now and it's all going to rocket? No, but it's a first sign and it's positive. You know, it's nice to see it happening so early in what we believe is the next part of the cycle. Does it mean it's guaranteed to continue? No, of course not. Anything could happen. But based on what we know and what we expect, these news stories haven't come as a shock. So we've been building up to this for a few weeks now, but today, the day that this episode goes out, tickets for Property Hub Live are available. Well, they might be. They might have sold out, Rob.
Yeah, they might. We've had a lot of early interest. I mean, a lot of people were there waiting to jump on these as soon as they came out. So depending on when you're listening to this podcast, the tickets might all have gone because there's not a vast number. But go over right now to propertyhub.net/events and you might see that there are still tickets available. And if they are, then I strongly encourage you to get one and come and join us because it's going to be quite a day, Rob.
It's going to be a fantastic day. So we're going to be joined by hundreds of hubbers who are going to be in the room live with us. We'll be speaking, of course, throughout the day. We'll also, I don't know if this is a good idea, but we've committed to it now. We're going to be doing a live podcast. We've only done this once before. It was brilliant fun. We'll see if we're saying that after the event, but we're going to attempt to do a live podcast in front of hundreds of people. And we've got some incredible speakers throughout the day, one of which is Tom Bloxham, one of the founders and creator of Urban Splash, one of the most impressive developers in the whole of the UK. The story of Urban Splash, its creation, its growth, and what he's learned is going to be told by Tom. It's going to be an incredible day. And then, of course, if that wasn't enough, there's a great chance for networking with all the people there, and then a huge meetup at the end of the day, Rob.
Yeah, our biggest meetup ever. It's going to be great. And the whole point of the day is not to go through the basics of like what property investment is and why it's so good, because we can do all that on the podcast and have been doing it on the podcast for years. What this is about is what property investment is really all about. So everybody who's speaking is going to be sharing their story, sharing their experiences, bring you some real practical knowledge and some great tips that you can learn from. So Rob's already talked about Tom Bloxham. We've got people showing case studies on all manner of different strategies and a lot more besides.
Yeah, this is a real celebration of property. This is a fun day. In a way, it's quite selfish because we're bringing in all the people we want to hear from ourselves and then lobbing ourselves in the mix as well and just building what we think is the perfect property day. It's in an amazing venue. It's in the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which looks fantastic. Shame about the team, but the stadium is incredible. And we're not doing this for profit. We're just covering costs. It's just a celebration of property. We're fortunate that we have the audience size, we have the community, that's you, who allows us to do this and bring you all together and put something on of this size and stature. So we're not charging, £1,500 or anything daft like that. There's no selling on the day, none of that nonsense. It's about £100 for your ticket for the day. For a venue of that quality, the lunch, the meetups, and all those speakers, that's just bonkers value. We'll probably make a loss on an event, but it doesn't matter because it's going to be a brilliant day. So get over to the page where you can get tickets if there's still any available. If you've missed out, there'll be a waiting list that you can get your name on. And if any tickets release in the future, of course, we'll let you know. And the link you need to go to, Rob, is
propertyhub.net/events.
Good luck. Hope you get a ticket. We hope to see you there. So, Rob, a couple of weeks ago, you gave me a bit of homework. You said, I've got an article for you, and I think you should have a read, and we should do a podcast on it. What you didn't tell me was how long the article was. But it was really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this. So, do you want to give the backstory on what this article was about, and if people are time poor, save the listeners from having to read it all?
Yeah, so this is a special report on housing that came from a January issue of The Economist. And I didn't tell you that it was 12 pages long, but it is quite chunky. And there's lots in here to get into because it's a look not only at property in the UK, but takes a global perspective and takes a look at property more broadly in what you might call like Western advanced economies or something like that. And it gets into all the issues around housing, like inequality between generations and what governments are doing and the balance of home ownership versus renting and how different countries handle the issues around housing. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to have a conversation around because we talk about this kind of thing a lot, but here is a major publication who's pulled in all kinds of expertise and takes a pretty balanced view, doesn't really have a dog in the fight one way or the other. So it'll be interesting to see what they're saying and to what extent the views that they put forward agree with or disagree with ours.
So the main theme of this article, although it does cover lots of different areas, is the discussion around supply and demand, or put simply, the fact that we don't build enough houses, and because we don't build enough houses, property prices increase over the long term. That's something we talked about a lot on the Property Podcast, and it's something that is still true today, and not just true in the UK, but true in many other countries as well. We don't build enough, and therefore property prices increase. But the article goes into a lot more depth, as you'd expect, and Rob, one of the things it talks about in some detail is the planning system and how broken it is.
Yeah, one of the things the article talks about is the green belt. And this is something we've talked about on the podcast before, how there's this common myth that it's all beautiful, unspoilt grassland and can't be touched for any reason. But when you look at what actually makes up the green belt, that's not necessarily the case. So it makes that point, but it also talks about the planning system more broadly and contrasts a few different approaches that get used elsewhere in the world. So it gives the example of Singapore as having what it calls an autocratic planning system. In other words, the government owns the majority of the land. Then when they want more to be built, they will release some of that land and pretty much say what needs to be built there. In Germany, they have something called a rules-based planning system, which means, as the name suggests, that there are certain rules about what can be built where. And if all those boxes are ticked and the rules are met, then something can be built. And if they're not, then it can't. So it's very black and white. We, on the other hand, have something that they call a discretionary planning system, which means there are rules, but local people have a lot of say over what does and doesn't get built near them. And we've got direct experience of this, Rob. We've been through planning applications before, and you go through the process and all kinds of objections get brought up, some of them sensible, but some of them seemingly designed just to try to stop anything from being built. And there's this general view that people on the whole don't want things being built near them because they think the extra supply will both put a pressure on local services that they use and also potentially reduce the value of their home. So the article raises the point of whether we should actually move to something more like Germany. So there are rules. It's not just that you can throw up anything anywhere, but it's not so easy for people locally to block things from being built.
Yeah, in theory, that makes a lot of sense. But the problem we have is if we just have very basic, hard and fast rules that this is it, black and white, you can build it if it meets this criteria, you can't if it doesn't, I think we'll create fear And I think in some circumstances, the wrong stuff will be built in the wrong areas because what the right rules are for one area may be different for another area. And even, not even town by town, but you could say street by street. It clearly works in other countries, but I think it would be a huge shift in policy for us to adapt that model. I think one of the things the article doesn't touch on, I think it's important to raise, is that it says we need more property, and we do. We do need to build more homes. And it says in particular we need more in the southeast, which again is true. And by unlocking greenbelt and relaxing planning rules, we can build more. However, there is a restriction on the amount of land available in London and the southeast. It will run out at some point, even with better planning policy and freeing up some land that isn't currently used. I think it's too simplistic to say, right, if we build a few more homes, then we're going to be sorted. The article talks about how it's much easier because of planning policy to build homes in the northeast than it is in the southeast. But the northeast, as far as England's concerned, economically is one of the weaker areas. And I think this is what government and this article miss, is that rather than trying to build a few more homes in the southeast, what we should be trying to do is have a more balanced economy and have different areas around the country that are stronger for different reasons. Referenced Germany in the past on this podcast and how balanced their economy is. Different regions, different cities specialise in different things, and therefore it's a more balanced economy across the country. It's not relying on one city. London is an incredible city and does incredible things for our economy. But we shouldn't be placing all our eggs in one city basket. We should try and redistribute some of that wealth and some of that power and influence across the country. The UK isn't that big. It's easy to do. The transport links to accommodate that shouldn't be that hard to achieve, although we seem to find it very hard to build anything in this country. We're talking about HS2, which is a step in the right direction, but immediately we should be on with building train networks between the cities in the north, Scotland and everywhere else to make commuting between all these places a lot better, and then stimulating those areas with different tax breaks or incentives for businesses to base themselves there will make a huge difference. Now, Rob, I've kind of gone off on a bit of a tangent here, and this article doesn't even talk about this point, but I think it's important to make the point because just saying we need to build more homes, while it's correct, is too simplistic.
Yeah, that's spot on. And the article does make this point, but only really makes it in passing. I don't think emphasises it strongly enough. That the supply of land in the areas where people most want to live, in this case we're taking London, will always be limited. Even if you got rid of all planning restrictions and let people build anything anywhere, there's still a physical limit to how big London can get. Of course, it can spread out in all directions, but if you assume that, like now, most of the jobs and everything else are in the centre, there's still a physical limit to how long it takes people to travel to that centre. So it doesn't really solve the problem. The article makes the point that transport improvements in general have slowed down, which is true. You're very unlikely to get the same improvements in speed from getting from one place to another in the next 100 years as you did in the last 100 years. But there's still a lot that can be done to improve other cities so you're not so reliant on one particular area, but also to improve transport between cities. As our team will not hesitate to tell you, in the northwest, transport even between really important cities like Manchester and Liverpool is terrible. And if that was improved, and there's lots of areas of the country where the same thing is true, it would unlock lots of potential for people to live in areas where at the moment there's not a lot of development going on because the demand just isn't there.
Well, the article makes some really strong pointers around credit, Rob, and it talks about how property over the long term is influenced by supply and demand. But in the shorter term, the boom-bust cycle is more influenced by credit. Now, again, that's quite simplistic just to say it's these two factors, but they do have major influence, and broadly agree with that conclusion, that it is credit and the easing of it that makes property prices surge. And then once the cycle crashes, that withdrawal of all that credit then makes property prices fall and stagnate, and then eventually it starts to come back and it recovers. What was really interesting was when it looked at the UK and the US. And in the US right now, credit is easing. The regulation around who can provide credit in the US is different. And non-banks, as the article refers to them, have started to lend out in huge amounts. Over 60% of lending in America is done by non-traditional banks. And the criteria they apply to people getting lending is a lot more relaxed than traditional banks. So what is starting to happen is that next phase of the property cycle is going to hit in because the credit is so freely available. And if it's already started, you can imagine that trend will continue and more competitors will get in and push that on further. In contrast, though, the UK hasn't experienced this. Banks and challenger banks are a lot more restricted in how they can lend, and therefore we've not seen property prices starting to rise off the back of free and unrestricted credit. Interest rates are low, which we'll come to, but what's really interesting for me, Rob, is when credit is loosened in the UK, and I do believe it's a when, not an if. When credit is loosened, because we will forget the lessons, how much it will be loosened will determine how big of a boom we will have in this cycle. And something that we've talked about, not on the podcast, I don't believe, before, is that currently, as things stand, the cycle that we are in might not be as aggressive because credit isn't as loose as previous cycles. However, that could change in 12 months and the whole landscape could change, and the government may make it easier for banks to lend, because if banks can lend and they're not restricted, they will.
Well, this is it. At the moment, everything's very sensible, because the powers that be have looked at what happened last time around, what led to the boom and the subsequent crash, and they really don't want a repeat of that because it created such systemic risk. And so they've put measures in place in an attempt to dampen things down and prevent that from happening again. So as investors, we're familiar with the rules around multiples of rents. So the amount you can borrow is now constrained not only by the value of the property, but by the rental income. So that keeps a lid on things in that sense. But also among owner-occupiers, there are rules about the proportion of mortgages that can be made at high multiples of incomes. And I think from memory, what they consider high is a loan of over 4.5 times income. So if those measures stay in place, it's going to keep a bit of a lid on how fast things can grow, because it's going to be constrained and rely on growth in wages and rents in order for that growth to happen, at least among people who want to use mortgage lending. But Rob, you said it's a case of when rather than if those rules get relaxed or taken away. And I'm inclined to agree with that, because if there's one thing we know about governments, it's much as they say that they don't want a housing boom, and they're concerned about the ability of people to afford houses, they actually quite like it when prices are rising, because when house prices are going up, people feel wealthier, they spend more, and they have this general sense that things are going well, and therefore they're more likely to re-elect whoever is currently in government. So that temptation is always there, and if they give in to that temptation, then we could well see a more aggressive second half of the cycle than it currently looks like is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article does talk about that in some depth, how governments are incentivised to increase home ownership. But it is declining in the UK. It has previously been as high as 75%, and now it's down to 65%. But is that a bad thing, Rob? In some countries like Singapore, it's 98%, and in countries like Germany, it's around 48%, which is the right model.
Well, it's a tricky question, and the article makes the point that you can't draw a straight line between proportion of homeowners and any kind of outcomes, because Singapore and Germany, both very successful countries, both with very different proportions of homeowners. And you've also got countries like Romania, which has the highest proportion of home ownership in the world, but definitely has its problems. So it's not as straightforward as lots of homeowners equals good. But there does seem to be this kind of inbuilt presumption that that's the case. And I think it is a presumption that's worth challenging. Home ownership in the UK is declining. It's now, I think, down to about 65% from a peak of about 75%. Is it going to keep on declining? I think it might do. But I don't think we'll get to the point where you end up with a minority of people owning homes like in Germany, because I think there is a large cultural aspect to it as well. But I'm not convinced that in itself that decline is a bad thing, because up to a point it does just reflect the way that people are now living. Perhaps in the past, when everyone had a job for life, being fixed to one place made a lot of sense and having that security. But now, rightly or wrongly, that's not the case. People, by and large, tend to move between jobs quite regularly. So while there are parts of your life when you'll want to be rooted and have stability, there might be other parts of your life when you want to have more flexibility. So not owning your own home can actually be beneficial.
Yeah, and the article at the very beginning tries to make an argument that renting is negative, or the inability for people to become homeowners is a negative thing. And while people not having the option to become homeowners is probably not great, because you'd want people, if they truly want to become homeowners, to be able to do so, the point around that renting is negative, I think, is kind of lost, and they lose their way in their article, because they then talk about how Germany gets a lot of things right, where more people rent than own. So I don't think it delivers on that point very well. And because more people are renting, that means the people who do rent are getting a larger voice, a stronger voice, and the government, not just in the UK, but in other areas around the world where this is happening too, are having to respond to the needs of people who rent and make sure that they are well looked after, not just homeowners. And it talks about some of the things that have changed and are going to change or potentially going to change. So already we've had a ban on lettings fees, which is a great move for tenants. And it also talks about how we may see longer tenancies as standard in the future as well. And again, I think that's a win-win for those who are the investors, the landlords, and for the tenants.
Yeah, I didn't realise the extent to which the increasing in rights for tenants was a global phenomenon. So it's something that we are aware of in the UK because tenant fees have been banned, and now there's talk about removing Section 21. But this is happening elsewhere as well. And pleasingly, in most places, this seems to be happening without using rent controls. That is happening in some cities, but most cities seem to acknowledge that they don't work, which is positive because they don't, and are trying to find other ways of striking the right balance instead. In New York City, for example, they've just banned tenant fees, which is a really big deal because if you thought tenant fees were bad in the UK, where it was a few £100s, in New York City, it was standard for brokers to charge 15% of the annual rent and all of it to be paid by the tenant, which is just nuts. So that going away is quite significant. And we're seeing the same thing elsewhere as well. So I think squeezing the middleman is pretty unambiguously good. Better security of tenure for tenants is also, I think, good, but it's going to be more challenging for people who own maybe just one property because, of course, if it's harder for them to get somebody out of that property who's not paying their rent, for example, then that affects 100% of their portfolio. Whereas if you take the case of a portfolio landlord or, at the extreme end, a company that owns hundreds or thousands of properties, it's affecting a much smaller proportion of their portfolio and not hitting their cash flow so hard. So I can see why smaller landlords are scared of this or even angry about this, but I do think you have to balance that out against the needs of a large group of people. We do have quite an extreme situation at the moment where for owner-occupiers, the average amount of time that they stay in one home, this is from memory, but I think it's about 19 years, which is a really, really long time. And for renters, the amount of time that they spend in one place is around about 4.5 years, I think. So there is no magic right amount of time, of course, and some of that variation will be caused by age-related factors. But you can probably say, well, the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle, in that there'll be some renters who want to stay somewhere for longer than they're able to. And at the other end, you'll have owners who want more flexibility, but for various reasons end up stuck in one place longer than they want to be. So anything you can introduce to allow people to be where they want to be, when they want to be, for as long as they want to be, is positive for the market as a whole.
So what does all this mean for you listening, property investor or potential property investor? Well, ultimately, nothing dramatic has changed yet. Supply and demand is still out of kilter, and I can't see that changing. Should it change, and should it be fairer, and should we build more homes? Yes. But we are where we are, and we don't build enough homes. And a bit of easing of planning isn't going to fix it either. It's a very complex issue, and it's a very complex problem to solve. And I don't believe there's the appetite from this government or any really to properly solve it. It would mean a lot of changes, some of which would be seen as unpopular, potentially very unpopular, and politicians are motivated by votes. So expect to see property cycles continue. The article, Rob, says, in many countries it is plausible that the house prices could now persistently rise faster than incomes. Currently, though, Rob, you don't feel that is the case for the UK right now?
Well, I do think that house prices will rise faster than incomes in some parts of the country, at least over the rest of this cycle. Whether it will happen persistently over multiple decades, I don't know. But I don't see a driver in place at the moment for a massive boom. If you go back as far as the 70s, which is when we started to really see aggressive growth in property prices, pretty much all the way from there to the present day with a couple of blips in the middle. At any given point during that time, you could point to one big driver that's causing that. We don't need to go through them all now, but there was always a cause. But now I don't see any of those necessarily in play. But from a property investor's point of view, property booms are not necessarily a good thing because it means that after that you're going to get a property bust, even if you end up with years of property just growing by 3% a year. Well, leverage to 75%, that's 12% a year, which is pretty good. And because of that, ownership of assets is the way to get wealthy, and people who have access to finance to acquire those assets tend to do better than the rest as well. I think it's important to make the point that while we say, oh, renting is no bad thing, I think that's true. I do think it's important that everyone has the ability to own assets, because you don't have to live in your asset, even though for most people their own home is their largest single asset and in many cases their only asset. You do need to own some assets. It's the only way to get wealthier, especially in a low interest environment, especially with things like QE. If you end up with a large proportion of people renting and them not being able to invest in any other assets other than their own home, then you've got one group of people with assets benefiting from the kind of policies that cause those assets to grow in value and getting progressively wealthier, and another group getting left behind. And I think that's the real political debate here. It's not about owners and renters. It's about people with assets and people without assets. And that's what governments should be concerned about.
Absolutely, Rob. I agree with all of that. And the fundamentals are in place for long-term steady growth. Where it may not be steady, though, is when, because I do believe when, credit is loosened. Now, it's how much it's loosened will determine on how much of a property boom we go into. But I just can't see the banks standing by and watch while America booms and the UK just goes through steady growth without having some influence and being able to lend and have their piece of the pie. So will credit ease? Yes. Will it ease a lot? We'll see. And it's the amount that it's eased by will determine on how big of a boom we go through in this particular cycle. Now, you may want a boom because you want to take advantage of it. But as you've said, Rob, the investment case for property investment over the long term remains strong with or without a boom. So what can you take away from this? Well, property investment is still a great investment. Renting will become easier and better, and there will be changes that some investors won't like to make lives easier for people who do rent. But I think it's too skewed at the moment in the landlord's favour. I'm not saying it needs to be dramatic changes, but there does need to be changes. There does need to be a rebalancing so that people are encouraged to rent longer and have that security. It means that investors will have to up their standards. And again, I think that's a good thing. I think the private sector coming into renting is going to do that as well. And they're going to offer that flexibility if you don't. And guess what? They'll win if you don't. So the government pushing property investors to do that, I see overall as a good thing. So can we fix property investment? Well, no, because we haven't got a solution for building more houses in the UK. And while we strongly believe that there should be a rebalance of the economy in the UK, the government are making noises that they want to do that. But are they going to have the ambition and drive to really do it, really transform the country? As it stands currently, no. So the one to watch out of all of this is credit. That's the one thing that could change sooner rather than later. And if it does, so will the market.
So every week we like to share a success story from a listener just like you, because that's what it's all about. It's about learning, but then it's about taking action. And we love hearing about the action we take so we can enjoy it and so it'll inspire others as well. So whatever success means to you, however big or small, let us know about it. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Property Hub UK. You can let us know on the Property Hub forum. You can leave us a podcast review. You can do whatever you like. And Lucas recently took the latter of those routes and left a review of the podcast. He said, I've been listening for a few months now and highly recommend this podcast to anyone. Fantastic knowledge, tips and advice, which are all free. I'm 31 years old and have just had an offer accepted on my 5th rental property. Wow. My most recent purchase being in Manchester, which I most definitely would not have considered if it wasn't for Rob and Rob. Keep up the good work. Well, you keep up the good work, Lucas. 5 properties by the age of 31 is pretty impressive by anyone's standards. And it sounds like you've picked a good location for it as well. So well done. And thanks for letting us know.
Right, it's time for Hub Extra, that part of the show where we try and give you that little bit more. And this is all backed up by an email that goes out every single Friday to everybody who's signed up to the Property Hub website. They get even more Property Hub Extra goodness. So make sure you take advantage of that. It's another free service that we offer. But for now, I have a podcast recommendation for you. And the podcast is called Meditative Story. And it's a really interesting take on delivering a podcast. People relax and mentally have a break in different ways. Some people like to go for a walk. Some people like to meditate. Some people like a glass of wine. I like all three. It all works. But what I really like about this podcast is it allows me to combine two of those things, which is walking and meditating. It's hard to describe what this is, so I'm going to read the description from their podcast notes, and it says, Meditative Story is a completely new kind of listening experience that blends intimate first-person stories with mindfulness prompts, enveloped in a beautiful music composition. And that's exactly what it is. It's hard to describe. So I'm really just going to recommend that you go and check it out and listen to it. But how I use this podcast is if I'm going for a walk, I will listen to one of these podcasts as well. And I found that my walking experience has been enhanced. And I've not only just enjoyed the walk, but I've also come back just a little bit clearer, a little bit more settled in my mind. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a great podcast, and I highly recommend you checking that out. It's not one for while you're working away and you've got a podcast on in the background. It's not that type of podcast. You need to be present when you're listening. But I do think that if you struggle with meditation, this might be an interesting introduction for you, and hopefully a way of allowing you to switch off.
But whatever you do, don't switch off from the Property Podcast, because we're going to be back next Thursday with another episode. And before then, a reminder that tickets for Property Hub are on sale and are available, at least as of now. Go check if they still are at propertyhub.net/events.
So that's us done for another week. We'll be back, of course, on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob, and back with the Property Podcast next Thursday. Of course, we will be. So until then, take care, everyone. Have fun. Bye-bye.